Union Army General William Sherman famously said, "War is hell." He probably referred to war in general, but he easily could have been describing trench warfare, a military tactic traced back to the Civil War. Welcome to American Soldier. How was it to live in the trenches, with horrible conditions inside and permanent death on the outside? Make sure you guys watch to the end to find out. Trenches are long, deep ditches dug as protective defenses. They are often most associated with World War I, and the result of trench warfare in that conflict were hellish indeed. Trench warfare in World War I was used mainly on the Western Front, an area of northern France and Belgium that saw combat between Germany and allied forces of France, Great Britain, and later the United States. Although trenches were hardly new to combat, they were used as defenses against attack, such as moats surrounding castles, before the advent of firearms and artillery, but they became a fundamental part of the strategy with the influx of modern weapons of war. Long, narrow trenches were dug by the infantry soldiers who would occupy them for weeks. They were designed to protect World War I troops from machine gun fire and artillery attacks from the air. The trench warfare on the Western Front was one of the most sustainable onslaughts on the human nerve. Imagine your frail body between the ooze of premarital slime and the terrors of shell fire on the other. By November 1914, armies on the Western Front were stuck head-to-head in a series of zigzagging trenches, which soon developed into an enormous subterranean world of the underground people. There were trenches at Gallipoli and the Italian front, but the longest ones were stretched weaving for 470 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. It was an emblematic terrain of the First World War memory. As Harold Macmillan wrote on May 13, 1916, "In those miles of the country lurk like moles and rats. It seems thousands, even hundreds of thousands of men planning against each other perpetually some new device of death." Apart from the Germans, the biggest enemy on the Western Front was mud. Indeed, the battlefield's flooded trenches and churned landscape are among the most potent symbols of the First World War. Particularly at Pas-Chandelet, trenches were notoriously sodden due to the wet weather and the high water table of this low-lying area, much of which was reclaimed by marshland. Conditions turned into a disaster by the shelling, which had disrupted normal drainage. A dry spot to sleep or rest was a rarity. Even though pumps were used to remove water from trenches and dugouts, many people died from trench foot, a fungal infection caused by immersion in cold water. It was a painful condition in which dead tissue spread across one or both feet, sometimes requiring amputation. Rats and lice were soldiers' everyday companion. Rats devoured corpses and grew as big as cats. Although lice were unknown, they were vectors of another common wartime ailment, trench fever. Oh, the smell. As you can imagine, there was a smell. Imagine a blend of stinking mud mixed with rotting corpses, lingering gas, open latrines, wet clothes, and unwashed bodies. The main toilets were located behind the lines, but frontline soldiers had to dig small waste pits in their own trenches. With soldiers fighting nearby in unsanitary conditions, dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were common and spread rapidly. Trench mouth, a type of gum infection, was also a huge problem caused by stress of non-stop bombardment. Being trapped in trenches for long periods of time under nearly constant bombardment caused shell shock, the debilitating mental illness known today as post-traumatic stress disorder. The mixture of chloride and lime to protect against disease and infection only added to the stink. While the front line sight, smell, and noise frequently overwhelmed new arrivals, old hands quickly became hardened to the discomforts and dangers of the trench life. At the beginning of World War I, forces mounted attacks from the trenches. With bayonets fixed to their rifles, they climbed over the top edge of a no man's land, the area between opposing forces, usually in a single straight line and under barrage of gunfire. This approach was rarely practical and often led to mass casualty. However, if successful, these soldiers would breach enemy lines and circle around to attack their opponents from the rear, with the comrades mounting a traditional offensive at the front. The brutality of trench warfare is best symbolized by the 1916 Battle of Somme in France. British troops lost over 60,000 men on the first day of fighting alone. Trenches never slept at night and were hives of activity. Although there was a continued risk of night bombardment or trench raids, the cover of darkness let troops attend to vital supply and maintenance tasks. Uncover evening. Soldiers often climbed out of their trenches and moved into no man's land, the blasted landscape separating the two armies. Here, work parties repaired barbed wires or dug new trenches. More aggressive operations involved patrolling for the enemy activity or conducting raids to kill or capture enemy troops or gather intelligence. Food and water were brought to the front line, and new units swapped places with soldiers returning to the rear for rest and recovery. Construction parties energetically repaired trenches and fortifications, laid duckboards and wire, and prepared artillery positions. To help uncover enemy activity along the front, both sides made observation or listening posts in front of their trenches. Patrols were also sent into no man's land to teach soldiers to recognize the battlefield terrain, find enemy listening posts, and identify gaps in the wire defenses where German patrols entered no man's land. Everyone would stand ready for action an hour before daybreak as another day dawned over the bleak battlefield. Trench raids were an effective and only way to fight face-to-face outside of a significant battle. The primary purpose of these raids was to maintain aggression and intimidate and unsettle the enemy in the trenches opposite. At the same time, prisoners, captured documents, and other material also provided valuable intelligence. They were carried out at night by groups of 50 to 200 men, but required careful planning and execution. Holes were cut by special artillery bombardments or wire-cutting teams before scouts went through the gaps. When close enough, the assault party rushed the trenches, surprising and overwhelming the enemy. Most raids spent 15 minutes in the enemy trenches to escape a counterattack. The attackers returned with a few prisoners and trophies if the raid succeeded. The raiders usually expected a furious enemy bombardment in response or a counter raid within a day or two. The Germans were known for effectively mounting nighttime raids behind enemy lines by sending highly trained soldiers to attack the enemy trenches on weak points. Surprisingly, not every single day was an exercise in horror. It was also boredom, interrupted by bursts of terror. An ordinary day was spent in a small, dark dugout where the soldiers made tea, made lunch, and gossip. One exception was the Christmas truce. During the first Christmas of the war, something surprising and unique happened on the Western Front. On Christmas Eve, soldiers from both sides put down their weapons and met in no man's land. Together they sang Christmas carols like Silent Night. World War enemies gave gifts to each other. The German gave sausage to the British, while the British gave the Germans chocolate. A British soldier kicked a football out of his trench on Christmas Day, and the Germans joined in. Rumor says Germany won the match 3-2. The British High Command disagreed with the truce and suggested the Germans were planning an attack. Luckily, they were ignored and no guns were fired on Christmas Day, 1914. The truce lasted until the new year, but soon, soldiers on both sides returned to the brutal life in the trenches. Of course, everyone's trench experience was different. It varied according to rank, sector, and unit. The life of a private was different from that of an officer. Daily experience differed from being sheltered in underground bunkers with a piano. The Germans had more profound and more comfortable bunkers, or playing with a dog to standing knee-deep in mud. Even in so-called quiet moments, trench life witnessed a steady trickle of death and maiming. Outside of formal battles, snipers and shells killed soldiers in the trenches, known as wastage. This regular death toll ensured the need for constant reinforcements. In the 800-strong infantry units, wastage rates were as high as 10% per month, or 80 soldiers killed. Trench warfare likely made World War I one of the most deadliest conflicts in global history. 1 in 10 of all fighting forces in battle was killed. It was also the first war in world history to have more deaths caused by combat rather than disease spread through fighting. What terrors of the trench warfare would scare you the most? Leave your opinion in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any uploads and you can enjoy excellent content we send your way.